Let's start. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of, and this is, I think, also welcome to those who are online, on behalf of course, our host here, the Einstein Center for Digital Future. They are providing this wonderful space and also the technical apparatuses to get online. Then, of course, the Einstein Foundation, especially its award section, the Berlin University Alliance, and the BRH Quest Center. We are here to discuss and learn about good practices of genomic big data and AI, and that's why it is a great pleasure for us that we have Yves Moreau with us. He is certainly one of the pioneers and champions in this field, and the reason why he is here is because tonight he will be awarded the Einstein Foundation Award for promoting quality in research, which is not your normal type of award. It's not given out for specific breakthrough science of a person, but rather for having impact on quality in research, on trustability, on ethics. So we are congratulating you, and we're very happy that you are here. And so we thought this is a very good opportunity to, around your visit, to discuss the issue of good practices in genomic big data and in AI, and do this with an expert panel. I will briefly introduce this panel to you. It's hosted and moderated, and we're very grateful for this, by Philipp Hacker. He holds the chair for Law and Ethics of the Digital Society at the European New School of Digital Studies, ENS, at European University Viadrina in Frankfurt-Oder. His research focuses on the regulation of digital technologies more broadly, and in particular on artificial intelligence. He frequently advises national and EU institutions in these matters, and these, for example, are the German and the European parliaments or the European Commission. Then we have data scientist Helena Mihaljević. She is from the HTW Berlin, who is also affiliated with the Einstein Center for Digital Future here, and works on topics such as privacy-sensitive modeling. Then we have Vince Madai. Here he is. Vince is a responsible AI researcher. He's a colleague at the Quest Center, and his research focuses on trustworthy AI in biomedicine, healthcare, but also in meta-research in AI and AI ethics. And then we have neuroscientist Susanne Schreiber. She's Einstein Professor for Theoretical Neuroscience at Humboldt University, and she also serves as Vice Chair of the German Ethics Council. And finally, I already, of course, mentioned it, we have Yves Moreau. He works at the University of Leuven in Belgium, and he develops algorithms for use in large-scale data analysis that guarantee the protection of privacy. And I already mentioned it, is a concerned scientist advocating ethical standards in the utilization of DNA data in the age of artificial intelligence. This is a topic that he will, I think, let us more about, and also his engagement in these the problems that are associated with this. And we're very much looking forward to your kicking off this panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. All right, let's see how this works. Let's start simply. There is only one slide, so I have to change the. Sorry. It's I didn't realize it was a. Yeah, it's a PDF here. Okay, and now I need to get it full screen. I'm not sure where full screen is. Can you give me a little help here? All right, super. And now, super. All right, so to get the discussion started, let me come a little closer. I feel like there is a barrage separating us. I wanted to talk a little bit about what has kept me busy the past 7 years or so, and which I summarized by this quote that a reporter at Science said, "Oh, that's the title," in an interview that I did a few weeks back, and I thought it's actually a good summary of the kind of advocacy that I do. So, for my background, I'm trained as an engineer and as an applied mathematician. I do research in bioinformatics. So for 20 years, I've done research on human genetics, on better analyzing human genomes, for example, to discover the mutations that cause certain genetic diseases. And that actually brought me in contact with a community, the clinical geneticists, the physicians who see often kids with genetic disorders. That is a very interesting community where actually ethical standards are really a lived practice. They are part of your day-to-day routine, not necessarily on a daily basis, but they are part of the environment, and you actually, once in a while, have these questions, okay, what should we do now? What is good for our patients? What is respectful? What is good for society, for example, when we develop new technology? So over the years, I got more sensitized to ethical issues in biomedicine. And about 10 years ago, I started getting interested in, well, we get all this data to analyze. How do we make sure that we do that in a way that's respectful of the privacy of patients and their families? And then about 7 years ago, very much by accident, I came in contact with some issues abroad, first in Kuwait and then in China, where I really had the feeling that genetic data was being misused. So you probably will have heard by now about Xinjiang, where ethnic Muslim minorities, the Uyghurs, but also the Kazakh and the Uyghurs live, and that this province of China has been the theater of severe persecution, crimes against humanity, against the Uyghur population and other minorities. And actually, this repression, this persecution is driven in part by mass surveillance. Of course, there are camps. There is forced birth control, there is forced family separation with kids being sent to boarding school to actually only learn Mandarin and not their Uyghur language. People are sent to the other side of the country to work in factories away from their families, so a breakdown of social cultures pushing towards assimilation. But that system is in large part driven by mass surveillance, which is all modalities of mass surveillance. A lot of it is, for example, surveillance camera. We've seen research on identifying people by their ethnicity, in particular Uyghurs and Tibetans based on their face, and how you can track Uyghurs across the streets of any city across China based on that technology. And one of the elements in mass surveillance is DNA databases. So the classical law enforcement DNA databases that are supposed to be used by crimes are part of this architecture of social control. And so we've seen evidence. I've collaborated closely with Human Rights Watch over the years. We've seen evidence for the deployment of DNA databases of the entire population. The idea is to collect everybody's DNA just in case. Okay, what is the direct effect on repression? Well, maybe it's not super clear, but we know that if your beard is too long, if you pray too many times a day, you can be sent to a camp. So you can see that as part of that, deploying DNA databases might have a very strong psychological effect where the authorities actually control what you're doing, who you are, what your relations is with others. And two elements struck me. First, the role of biotech suppliers who were selling the technology like it was candies. There was a big market. Police stations across Xinjiang wanted to buy a lot of that. We saw, for example, first purchase of 12 DNA sequencers for the Xinjiang police. There's only 25 million people living in Xinjiang. You don't need 20 labs, and then in the end we realized it was 40 DNA sequencers. You don't need so many DNA sequencers if what you want to do is just solve crimes, real crimes with real murders, real rapes. That requires this kind of technology, but that didn't seem commensurate, proportionate with the deployment that we were seeing. So that was the first aspect. Actually, because of the trade war between the US and China, this question got amplified. Obviously, it was not just human rights activists and advocates protesting. It was all part of a bigger geopolitical movement that was actually sanctions, for example, deployed by the US administration against the police of Xinjiang, severe pressure against Western suppliers like Thermo Fisher or Promega to stop their sale to the Xinjiang police. More recently, Tibetan activists achieved the same thing for the sale of those products in Tibet. That was the first part. The second part is how the deployment of this technology was prepared very tightly upstream through academic research. So this is only one example of about 1,200 papers on forensic population genetics, so genetics of different populations, because you need to calibrate your DNA databases to each population in which you want to use it, and forensic, because that's really the law enforcement technology. So we're not talking about genetics in general. I'm not complaining about the fact that you do cancer research on Uyghurs. We're really talking about research. This is here involving researchers from Thermo Fisher, a big US biotech company, and researchers affiliated with police-like institutions in China to validate a new generation of the technology of Thermo Fisher for use by the Chinese police. And it's validated on Uyghurs, Tibetans, and Hans. So you can see the patterns emerging there. That actually led me to start an action to try to actually get dangerous research retracted, because obviously that research clearly is tied with actually the deployment of these databases as part of a mass surveillance infrastructure. And to give an example of what we've been able to achieve, that's a retraction from last year of a paper where another company, Promega, was actually validating one of its kits with a police bureau, forensic police lab of Guangzhou. And after protest, because this involves also US agency, which put a lot of pressure on them to say, oh, where we landed, we stepped on a mine, let's do something about that. That paper was actually retracted after just a few months, which is rare. I have been asking for retractions in many cases for 3 or 4 years. And to say that this is not just research, I mean, this is one of the co-authors of this paper, who is a police officer, active duty forensic scientist in Guangzhou. And the person on the left is sitting, it's probably a mock interrogation, is sitting on something called a tiger chair. That's a restraint device where you block the wrists and the ankles of a person, and they block their knees, and this is very painful after a couple hours. So it's essentially a torture instrument that is part of a propaganda video for that researchers. So what I have experienced is that it has been really hard to get those retractions. A lot of actually publishers who think this is really annoying, maybe also for economic considerations. And at the same time, also a lot of support. In particular, Nature has been very supportive, a lot of excellent editorial and journalistic work from people at Nature who have really supported this line of work. Of course, now recognition with a major award. So it also means that it's not just one way, there's not just resistance, there's also a lot of people who say this is an acceptable practice, we have to improve our research practice. And I want to conclude with a few observations, and 3 that are directly relevant to what I said, and one that is much more general. There's still a lot of ethical issues in academic publishing. When it is about individual fraud, it's still very hard. When it's about systemic abuses, then it's actually a lot more difficult to get the academic publishing industry to follow up on problems. Nevertheless, you know, this week I got my 30th retraction, and on the one hand, that's something I'm quite proud of. At the same time, it's also something very painful for the researchers that I'm affecting, who are not necessarily intending horrible things. I mean, it's a very complicated and gray zone to deal with, but significant impact is possible. In some key research fields, there is a lack of ethical culture. I was really stunned by the lack of ethical culture in forensic genetics. But that doesn't stop there. More generally, I'm an AI researcher, and I see that our community lacks actually good ethical awareness. We're just starting. You know, we didn't really realize that data could be dangerous 10 years ago. I mean, it's only the last 10 years that we started figuring that out. And that I think that there is a lot of opportunity there, because researchers in computer science and mathematical modeling, they lack this culture, but maybe they have just enough openness to acquire this culture and to radically change the fields of big data, information technology, and AI in the future. And that's, for me, what will come next after this award, is trying to move more into that field. How are we going to develop an ethical culture that supports good regulation and that supports good ethical behavior? And with this, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I hope that was a good way to get the discussion started.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Yves, for this inspiring talk. This is really highly influential and absolutely necessary advocacy and research that you're driving at the same time. What just struck me when you just talked was that you said that in your area, like 10 years ago, people started noticing that data can be dangerous. I'm a legal scholar, and I have a lot of people working on data protection. I myself work on data protection. Obviously, data protection scholars have been saying this for about 50 years and longer. So there is sometimes this kind of a bit of a disciplinary disconnect, I guess, and that's why it's so important to have discussions like these where these fields meet. And I think today, this discussion about AI and genetic data couldn't be more timely, right? Because you might have seen that just yesterday, the European Parliament passed the EU AI Act, which is the world's, or say the Western world's, first major comprehensive legislation on AI. In fact, China was faster, with a very specific spin on their laws that force generative AI models, for example, to adhere to good communist practices. Well, and the interesting thing about this law, and I was a bit involved in the negotiations, is that it was almost derailed at the very end for two reasons. One is that there was major controversy about how to regulate ChatGPT and other generative models or foundation models. And the other aspect was precisely RBI, remote biometric identification, and generally the questions at the intersection of AI and biometric surveillance and data. And the result that we have right now, I think, is much better than nothing. And every researcher, I guess, active in this field should be happy that we have now, or we will have, some minimum standards to guarantee that some of the worst breaches of human rights in surveillance in the public sphere, will be prevented or will be illegal under the AI Act. But actually, there's still a lot of room for improvement. So for example, when it comes to not real time, but ex-post biometric identification, video cameras, you just mentioned, you know, the Chinese model, and this was what everybody had in mind, that it's very clear that we don't want this in the EU, but still, if you have this kind of information and you run a facial recognition model on it, you can do a lot of things retroactively, and there are much weaker constraints in that field. And so civil rights groups have been very vocal in actually challenging the law from this perspective. And you don't even have to look all the way to China or Russia. You know, we know that in the EU, in countries like Hungary, for example, we have massive problems with democratic backsliding. And if we look at the German elections that are coming up, and the recent, Dutch elections, for example, he's from Belgium, of course, but still, our very own future is not so clear anymore either. So I think it is really high time to think about this interface more broadly of AI and data, genetic data, and to recognize that we have here in front of us two real dual-use technologies, right? So on the one hand, there is massive potential for detecting and potentially curing rare genetic diseases, for example, as the laureate has done in his breathtaking and really seminal research. But on the other hand, of course, in the wrong hands with malicious actors, some really bad things can happen. And that's why I'm so happy that today, and excited, we have a group of 4 wonderful people who are joining me for this discussion. So first, of course, Yves, who has already been introduced, the laureate of the 2023 Einstein Award. Very warm welcome again from my side. It's great to have you here in Berlin. Then comes Susanne Schreiber. She is, who was mentioned already, but just to recap, she is Einstein professor for theoretical neurophysiology at Humboldt University Berlin, and she's also the vice chair of the German Ethics Council. Great to have you. Then we have Helena Mihaljević, who's also a professor that is affiliated with the Einstein Center and professor of data science at HTW Berlin, working a lot on traffic data and privacy-preserving machine learning. And finally, Vince Marai from this very own responsible algorithm lab, let's say, at Quest at the Berlin Institute of Health at Charité Berlin. So great to have you all. Let's perhaps take a seat. And we shall try to have a bit of a discussion amongst the panelists here. And then we're absolutely curious to involve you both online and offline in the discussion for the last 20 minutes or so. But we'll start off with some thoughts here about what we've just heard and how we can go about going forward. So perhaps, Susanne, if I may ask, you studied biophysics and you work with mathematical models and apply them to neurophysiological problems. So in your area, when it comes to AI and data, what are some of the main concerns, ethical concerns that you see?
Yeah, so in the research area, I would say I'm not facing direct ethical problems because we try to develop methods and we apply them to electrophysiological data, and that's not usually related to patients. Mm-hmm. But if I look a bit further and go into medicine, then I see many ethical challenges that are awaiting us. So one example is that we have many AI applications that are being developed and we don't have a good quality control, right? So medical doctors start to use them, but there's no real criteria on what is a good application and how trustworthy is it. And very often we also have then an automation bias so that doctors start to rely more on the software than on their own judgment, or if they apply it too often, they also face a certain de-skilling, right? So if you imagine you're looking at pictures of radiography and you do the diagnosis all the time, if you don't do it yourself anymore, you lose some skills. So there's a wide variety of challenges that we're facing that may not be obvious at the first glance.
Yeah, that's really intriguing. And from what I hear from colleagues working in the AI field, and recently in Berlin, we had one of the responsible AI leads from OpenAI, which is, of course, the company developing ChatGPT and other models. And many of them agreed that the models are getting more and more potent, but the testing science actually is lagging far behind. And that's one of the big problems because we have emergent properties in these models that make it that oftentimes when you develop and put them onto the market, even the developers, they seriously don't know what all these models can do. Like chain of thought prompting, which is a particular way of eliciting information from large language models, was not known when GPT-4 came out. It was only discovered afterwards, as if you were doing research on some living being. So Vince, if I may ask, you're working with responsible algorithms. Can you give us some examples of the kind of tools and algorithms that you're developing or deploying to try to mitigate some of these concerns?
So what I would like to say about that is we have heard about ethical challenges, and you probably all heard about we want to be fair, we want to be robust, we want to be transparent. And the biggest challenge that we have, and I work mostly in healthcare, but this transcends healthcare to all the other areas, is that we basically do not really know, and this is typical for AI research, how to translate these into practical requirements when actually a tool is developed. This is at the core of why many of the applications actually fail on an ethical level is everybody wants to be transparent, everybody wants to be fair. But in the end, when you have to make the decisions in the development, the design, the day-by-day the decisions, it can be very, very rough, and we don't really have any guidance. So what we actually do is involved in EU grants, for example, is to actually develop methods, how to help researchers, developers to actually make these decisions based on co-creation methodologies, workshop methodologies, and associated responsible research practices. But the truth is, and there's research that's called AI ethics operationalization, we don't really know how to do it right now. And this is really the problem. So I can't really answer it because nobody really does it currently. And I think this explains a lot of the problems that we're seeing.
Yeah, maybe there's a checkbox for it. No, just kidding. Just tagging on to this, Yves, just occurred to me, Vince was just saying everybody wants to be transparent, and I'm sure this holds for many researchers. Is this also your experience from working with companies in the genomic data analysis field? In the AI field, we often have problems.
Many researchers want to be transparent, but then you get bubbles. And I would say, like in forensic genetics, it's incredibly untransparent. Like if you see a declaration like this, I collected 500 samples from this group, and the people provided informed consent, and this was all done in accordance with the Declaration of Helsinki. It's like 3 sentences. And then when you say, well, because this is a fairly dangerous situation, there might be minorities involved, there might be law enforcement involved, you'd like to know, okay, what were the details of the data collection? It's different, for example, if you have police officers involved in data collection, which is something that we have seen. We've seen, for example, ethical approval for research that was provided by the Ethics Committee of the Ministry of Public Security or the Ministry of Justice of China. And so those details, you need to get them, and we see that there's a lot of lack of transparency there. So I think that the theme of transparency is very strong in the AI research community. How it translates into effective practices in the fields where it matters most. So what I see is that we all have to run through the ethics treadmill, do a lot of paperwork. And then for me, what's an absolute frustration is to say, okay, we all have to do all these things. We have to check all these boxes and therefore fill in all, these requirements. And then you realize that can be gigantic areas where actually none of that really matters. So why do I have to wait for 3 months to get access to a data set because I have to provide proof that the data will be stored safely, that I have the research I want to carry out fulfills the consent that is available? If then I realize that, a little bit further down the street, somebody doesn't care about any of that. And to give you an example of how far this goes, individual DNA profiles of research participants can be put as an Excel sheet as a supplementary material of a publication. We're talking about tens of publications like that. And you say, well, why do I have to do all these efforts? So that is the unevenness of the efforts of people, and I think that is a very troubling.
Yeah, I can see how this is easily very frustrating. And I have to say, like in the general AI ethics community, there is perhaps one of the biggest problems at the moment about how to deal precisely with transparency vis-a-vis the most potent models. Because on the one hand, you have, as most of you probably know, you have some open source models like Llama 2 and Falcon that have been developed by Meta and Research Institute in the United Arab Emirates, where you can basically download almost all the parameters. And at the same time, you have other and even more potent models like Google's Gemini and OpenAI's GPT-4, and also now the Mistral large model that are not open at all, but they have good arguments for that as well, because in the wrong hands, these very potent models can actually be used by malicious actors for very bad things. So there's a very fine line between providing access to researchers, for example, to check and verify these models, while at the same time preventing literally terrorists from using them to, sample new kinds of viruses or just to, develop attack plans. So, Helena, how does this square with your observations in your field? You work a lot on traffic data and privacy-preserving machine learning. I suspect that there are ethical challenges as well. Many people, you know, are not so much in favor of, let's say, for example, live data concerning location data. How is this something that pops up in your field?
Right, so we do work on mobility data, human mobility data specifically, and this is basically very sensitive data that is really tricky to anonymize, or I would say actually impossible to anonymize if you really want to use it for serious modeling, because the way we move is very individual and very unique. Research shows that you need to know only a couple of location points of an individual to make that person unique within a data set, and you cannot mitigate this very easily by, I don't know, making it less granular in terms of time or geography. So that's a very tricky thing, and you would say, well, you know, why is this sensitive data? It is because one can find out that you are part of a data set, which sounds trivial, but it's not. To give you one example, there was, you might know it, there was a leakage of, so there was a data set that was apparently anonymized. It comes from a gay dating app. It was sold. I would also like to talk more, maybe not only about research, but also about practice. So this is like a data set collected by a company coming from an app, so it's from a gay dating platform, but obviously, identifying an individual in this data set can be really dangerous for that individual. And in that one case, it was a priest in the US who lost his job, and it had severe consequences on his life because he was basically targeted by a very conservative group of people. There are many other breaches like that one as well. So being part of a data set can be dangerous, but obviously knowing where you live, where you work, when you're at home, where you will be next, is a tricky thing. And AI can be used in positive ways, for instance, to try to generate data that is artificial, for instance, that can be used for modeling. It doesn't work so well with movement data so far, but I think this is also an interesting aspect of how you can actually use AI models to help mitigate privacy issues. In other data that we work with as well is a lot of social media data and textual data. And there it's quite interesting that very often people in computer science and also at the intersection of computer science and other areas like social science, political science, it often appears the situation that you have a data set that is openly available and then you suppose that you can just do with it whatever you want. And that's not the case. So a data set being accessible doesn't mean that you can use it for whatever you want, and there are highly unethical practices in that field as well. It involves a lot of computer vision. I would say computer vision is a really messy area, and it's really problematic, especially people working on facial recognition. So I think this is an area where one really has to pay serious attention. One example, the HRT transgender data set. This is a case that is, I think, well known. It's a couple of years ago where a professor in US university basically collected videos from, I think, 38 individuals who recorded their transition as transgender persons. And he used that data set, so he created this data set, shared it, and basically his motivation was to test face recognition technology for facial changes, which is not only like propagating transgender, an anti-trans stereotype, but really like using this without consent for completely unethical purposes, and so on and so on. And this is data from YouTube, so it's openly available, but you cannot use it for anything you want. So, yeah, I guess complex situation regarding many sources of data.
Yeah, those are great points that you make there. And let's also remember that, for example, if you're identified as being gay, you might lose your job in the US as you're a priest, but if you're in Russia or in Arabic countries, you might as well lose your life. In fact, one of the funny aspects about this, I guess, is that there's research showing, empirical research, that people assume that location data is actually sensitive data, whilst under the law, it is not. There's an exhaustive list of what constitutes special category data under Article 9 of the GDPR and Article 10 of the Law Enforcement Directive, and location data is not one of them. Now, there's a recent judgment by the CJU. You can see I'm a legal scholar, and that makes me excited because it's about Facebook, actually, the Meta versus Bundeskartellamt judgment, which is important for many reasons. But the CJU in this case said, if you can basically infer, deduce sensitive criteria from otherwise innocent data, then that becomes sensitive data in and of itself. And this has a huge impact that many people likely haven't quite wrapped their head around, because with this, much of the location data, I guess, will become sensitive data by implication, because of course you can derive all kinds of things like perhaps age, religion, whatever, ethnicity. And at the same time, super important point about, you can't just do anything with data that's out there. You have one of the exceptions in the GDPR about sensitive data being that it was revealed voluntarily by the individual, but that does not mean, which is what mostly all of the data data protection people say, that you can't just run any kind of analysis on it. So very good points, I think, and very important points. Shifting back a little bit to genetic data, we've heard from you, Yves, about some of your research and then about these massive problems with misuse. So in your field and in your own research, perhaps, how do you try to walk this very thin line about using that data for good purposes, while trying to avoid somehow feeding into this, even unknowingly, into this surveillance mechanism?
Well, I'm not sure we're able to do it at all. I think for me that's one of the huge emerging concerns. So in the past, the kind of DNA profiles I mentioned, these are law enforcement related DNA profiles, that are like the CSI DNA profiles you look at. And in the past, the medical DNA information was really different. You would have, let's say, a patient, a woman with familial breast cancer, and you would analyze the BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes to find a mutation. If you had a DNA sample from a crime scene, it would look at totally different information. So in the past, there was no overlap between biomedical genetic data and law enforcement genetic data. And I think that led us to the idea that law enforcement is not interested in medical genetic data, and that they are respectful of patient-physician privacy, which is an important value among doctors. But now the technology is changing. Medical work has already moved a lot over to next-generation sequencing, where we analyze a lot more of the genome. We will analyze the entire genome and say, well, let's look at BRCA1 and BRCA2, because that's actually, in the end, cheaper than looking at only a small part. There's technical reasons for that. And now law enforcement is also moving in that direction rapidly. That has taken some time. There's been a bit of a delay because the methods need to be very robust. They need to be cheap. But now these two things are coming together. So the information you collect for law enforcement and the information you collect at the hospital will be more and more compatible with each other. And I think that we are creating these massive databases, medical DNA databases, and then in the coming years we run the risk of facing the same kind of problems that consumer genomics, 23andMe have been facing the last decade. We're going to have the same problems with our biomedical DNA databases, and I think that we are totally unprepared.
Good news. So maybe let's just ask the other participants here, what are your thoughts about this dilemma? Any suggestions, or maybe just adding concerns? Susanne?
I think I would like to add a concern, because one thing is that we have this data and it may be misused, right? In Germany, at least, we really face this dichotomy that we have lots of medical data of patients around that could really help the patients, and we are not using it for research, right? So we are very open with our data, with it going away to companies, being misused. And on the other hand, we hinder our own basic research because there's a tremendous threshold just to be able to use it. So when we go for medical data, we often have to go to data from Sweden and other countries because that's where it's collected in a proper way and we can use it, but we refrain from using our own data. And to kind of solve that, right? So to have a responsible usage and to really exploit all the opportunities that we have to help individual patients, and on the other hand, to prevent this misuse, that's a really challenging problem. But I think we also need to change the German law a bit. I know there's something going on, or you already mentioned it, in the European Union, and I know that our government is also working on this, but we really need to work on both fronts to improve things.
Yeah, research data law is a big, big mess. And there are efforts to make this, to drain the swamp, but they haven't been successful so far.
So I would agree that we run the risk of death by bureaucracy. I'm afraid that from what I hear, things are even worse in Germany than in other European countries.
It's literal for patients, right? Death.
That is actually true. So how do you balance that? I think it's very difficult because you also have lots of social effects. So when you say, I need to talk about, difficult situation, then actually you run the risk of panic, moral panic, over-regulation, and that actually makes things worse on the other side. So I'm just not very sure. I mean, there can be technical solutions in part. I work on federated machine learning and things like that. That can be part of the answer, but I don't think they are like the answer. I think they're only like a small slice in a much more, in a broader reflection about how do we balance that. For me, one thing I advocate is really a culture. So when you see something, say something. I mean, the thing is that our solution is bureaucracy. We have problems, therefore we're going to add bureaucracy. We still have problems, we're going to add more bureaucracy. And then we have to go in this treadmill all the time, and still bad things happen, because when bad things happen, apparently people are shutting up and nobody is saying anything. So working also on a culture of empowerment to actually tell people, well, if you have doubt about what's going on, say something, maybe try to also develop a culture of non-retaliation, maybe also accept that sometimes there will be retaliation and that, well, maybe you need to find another job, and that's unfortunately part of the complicated situation you're facing. But I think that just regulation, for me, is not sufficient, because good regulation or regulation only works well when it feeds into the appropriate culture. When the regulation is at odds with the culture, which I faced really, I mean, a couple of weeks back, we were at a meeting on federated data analysis, and you could hear some people saying, okay, what's the best way? Is that the best way to go around the GDPR, which is not what this is for? And so you need the culture that people do understand that actually what are the risks, and these risks are real, they are tangible, and then maybe we can try to harmonize regulation and daily practices in a way that is not too much of a hassle on our lives. But I will acknowledge that unfortunately there is a risk that we're going to get more and more and more bureaucracy, and that we won't be able to do the research we urgently need to do, or provide the care that we urgently need to provide.
I think in Germany it's particularly bad because part of the legal landscape is on the Länder, so state level. So basically you want to do a research study in Hamburg, Berlin, and Bavaria. Oops, here you are with a couple of different laws, and all of them super complicated, which is why I think in the end, totally agree with you, we need very clear and slender, slick kind of new research data law that enables people rather than stopping them. But that comes at the same time with heavy safeguards, where people actually are not only invited, but forced to adopt state-of-the-art IT security mechanisms, for example, to prevent that kind of theft, hacking, and whatever from happening. And also, of course, with the monetary possibilities to actually implement that, because it doesn't really help you if you're required to do that, but you don't actually have you might be somebody working in the medical field. You're not an IT security specialist, and you might not even in your hospital have somebody who could easily answer that question. And then that culture question, I think, ties into a lot of the discussions that we're having, of course, about security in academia. I mean, you're a super established, full tenured professor. You can speak out. If you talk to postdocs, it's going to be a little more difficult. So I think there's a lot of related challenges in the academic field that need to be addressed urgently. Yes.
If I may comment on this quickly. My initial statement, I think also yours, related a lot to research and academia, and also my experiences. I would say most people would like to do good. Often they don't know how to. It's of course very different in the private sector. So it was, you mentioned culture. So when when foundation models appeared and the responsible research team of Google, Timnit Gebru, Margaret Mitchell, spoke out against it, Google fired them. So let's talk about culture. That's the culture. And I think it's very, very naive to assume that, I mean, you also showed the moment a multi-billion company wants to make money with their genetic equipment, then they go somewhere where they can do it. So I think it's very naive to assume that they will have a culture, an ethical culture, without being forced to. Maybe latest example, completely outside of AI, the moment the oversight became a little bit lax, Boeing planes started falling out of the sky. And now we start to see all the problems. So I believe that this normative domain of the law needs to be very strong when it comes to private actors that would make billions. And in other areas, we should probably stop harassing, people that want to be better with checklists that are super annoying. There is no balance, so I agree with that assessment.
Sorry.
Sure, but obviously there are not enough checklists at the same time. So, we're talking about companies doing breaches in data privacy or data ethics, but at the same time we have publications that are obviously not okay from considering any ethical standards. So at the same time, I see that we have, like in computer science, we have a couple of conferences that are trying to establish transparent ethics rules and that have, I would say, solid requirements, and people are doing research on transparency, documentation, data sheets, and so on, trying to make at least data collection processes and so on as transparent as possible, which I think are good efforts, but at the same time they are not really widely spread. So I would say considering research that involves data and AI, which is like broad and basically spread out in almost all disciplines, we do not really have proper standards when it comes to publishing that sort of research. So it shouldn't be the case that you have to fight so much for that kind of stuff to get retracted. So it's actually like, that should be clearer. So I find that really surprising. And maybe another aspect, so when it comes to data, and it also comes to models that we build from data and technologies that we build from data. So, and those technologies are not only the data that are being fed, but also how I model, how I use it, and so on. So technology has like a couple of more layers of complexity that come upon basically the basic training data layer. So when we want to find out how technologies work, do they discriminate? Do they help to discriminate? Do they produce any harm? It's really tricky to evaluate them as well. So when it comes to accountability and audits, it's actually another area where we need data. We would actually need real data, contextualized data, but we don't have them. And who's we? Most of these technologies that are relevant, and even those that are critical and high-risk technologies under the EU AI Act, won't be tested like in any sort of public and in any sort of participatory way. So I find that really problematic. So we will need data also to audit technologies, especially high-risk ones. And I don't see a lot of efforts and progress towards that. And also like in the AI Act, what I find interesting is like the whole monitoring part. Mm-hmm. So there is lots of best practices on like what you're supposed to do when you develop technologies. But after that, it's like, I read it as like, if somebody notices there is an issue, then you should say that. But who's going to say anything? Who's going to monitor that really? So I find that like kind of a, very weak spot.
Yeah, that's, well, a couple of points on that. That's great, absolutely great commentary. So I think on the one hand, I'd fully agree that there is this massive problem with, again, testing models in a way that is responsible and in a way that involves the major stakeholders. Because what's happening right now, fully agree with Helena, is that under the AI Act, you basically, for high-risk models, there's all kinds of best practices that now become mandatory. But then in the end, it's mostly self-certification by companies. Why is that? Because the alternative that the Commission pondered would have been even worse. The alternative that they were looking into was to establish some kind of TÜV, some kind of agency that would put a stamp on every model and model change. Now, you know how long it takes to, even get a medical device approved. So if you want to do this with ML, it's just you have a backlog up until the moon, right? So that wouldn't work either. So what I think is absolutely crucially missing there, and something I've been very vocal about to try to put this into the AI Act, and it didn't get through, is something akin to Article 40 in the DSA. So in the Digital Services Act, some of you might know this, it's the flagship regulation on platforms in the EU that has just kicked in. And there we have Article 40 where vetted researchers can have a right to get access to the platforms to look if they are doing a good job in vetting for or monitoring systemic risks. And a lot of people and myself, we said, you know, we need the same for AI. But somehow, magically, it didn't get in. And so here we are. Basically, we have to trust those who are developing it, and I think in many cases with, you know, with good intentions, but we just don't know. And that's highly problematic. I think I totally agree. And even more so for foundation models where even for the systemic risk models, so for the most potent ones, you have now an obligation for evaluation red teaming, but even the red teaming doesn't have to be external. So yeah, that's a very weak point, I'd say.
So in some of the projects that I'm involved in, we work with standardization bodies here in Germany, with the testing companies, and frankly, they have no idea how to test it at all. Mm-hmm. They are trying now frantically, also because they feel under pressure due to alternate legislation, to find some ways to standardize, to translate, let's say, trustworthy AI into some easy-to-measure numbers, which of course doesn't really work, especially if you think about my domain ethics, many ethical questions that you can't quantify, and they don't really know. So now to think that companies can now self-certify what even, let's say, the professionals have no idea how to do is probably not going to work.
Yeah, but it's difficult to point to a better solution, right? Because there is no good tests at the moment. The idea, I think, is that we have standardization bodies that will develop standards like Sensena, like ISO, until about the spring of 2016. So the major part of the AI kicks in summer of 2026, and they will develop until spring 2026. But we don't know what's in the standards, right? And if they're going to be more procedural or more substantive. Most likely, because there's so much disagreement, they're going to be procedural, which then in the end means you have to follow a couple of procedures, and whatever comes out is going to be, you know, fulfilling the standard, which is obviously a bit deficient. All right, yeah.
But wouldn't you agree that it's at least a good idea for medical applications to have such an institute or some group of professionals, external ones, that will test the software? Because, I mean, we have that for medication, and yes, it takes time. I mean, we're all glad that vaccines were tested, right, recently before they were used on humans. To some extent, this is not 100% proof, of course, but it's much better than nothing. I'm fully aware of that. You can't do this for any type of AI, and it's really, really difficult to find out whether it's fraudulent or whether it's working okay. But I think for medical parts, we should have standards, and we should have like a centralized institute or something. I see the bureaucracy, which I was arguing against before, right, and the stamping you already mentioned. But we have the Paul-Ehrlich Institute for Medications, and something similar for medical AI applications would be really useful from my perspective.
It is in the AI, actually. So actually, for some areas, and medical is one of them, there is external. So wherever you are in a highly regulated field that already has external certification, the AI model, the high-risk model, needs to be externally verified too. So for medical, that's the case, and also for biometrics, by the way. But for most of the other applications, anything related to employment, credit scoring, life health insurance, still pretty important areas, but there you don't have it. And so on the one hand, you could say, well, you should have it there too, but then the question is how to actually implement it, since we don't have, you know, there's no capacity. And I'm going to be very curious to see how it works in the medical field, actually. I'm totally with you that theoretically it's a great idea, and we should have it. But you need to have the personnel also to then get this going.
And there are various ideas of data trust and similar concepts that are still like very theoretical and very rarely implemented, but that could be a way to at least reason about that sort of fields and that kind of models being developed, and a way of bringing researchers together, but also like allowing for a more participatory design when it comes to evaluating. We've been working in the domain of employment for a while now, and it's really difficult, like, to figure actually out how you want to measure something, as you just said. Like, there is like not one number, there is many numbers, and it's always incomplete. By Deb Raji, I think she had a nice quote saying basically that something along the lines that you can never actually say that something is okay, like a model you've built is okay, but you can actually at least say it doesn't violate like the most basic problems. So it doesn't encounter the most basic problems. So you can do like some of the checks, and I think this is like worth doing it. But it's still not like a label of this is completely trustworthy and you can use it for free and stop thinking about it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess that's like a way to approach it maybe.
Yeah, very good points. And I was piqued by one of your comments before, because I've noted that too, that some of the top ML conferences, NeurIPS and so on, they have now these ethics sheets and data sheets that you need to fill out, but some others apparently don't. And I'm wondering, like in your fields, how do you actually note, how do you detect that something is problematic from a research ethics perspective? Because you said some of them, they were obviously problematic. And I'm wondering, like, also the papers you flag and you're vocal about retracting them, how do you go about detecting that from the outside?
So in our field, so when we think about, let's say, open data, so that might be even easier. We talk about open data and you read a paper and it, I don't know, shows you data from social media platforms. If you see like the full quote or even like user handles of users from platforms, then you already know like this shouldn't be like that. You see that even in recent papers from good conferences. Some of them get retracted. And then also you, if you read like ethics statements and they say something like, I don't know, this is an open data set, so obviously I can use it. Then that sounds too naive. So there is, like when data are basically just uploaded to platforms, then I guess there is even like a more, it's more crucial to have a closer look at, was there an ethics committee involved, who has actually approved of the of using this like that, etc., etc. So I guess like you will always have to look into the individual case, but I would say this is also something where there should be like safeguards by the journals and the conferences who should check that properly. So and some research is simply unethical on its own. I'm thinking of a paper, I think that was research conducted in China, where they actually tried to use computer vision to figure out if a person is a criminal or not, which is totally flawed anyway. So in terms of methodology, it was really bad. But there shouldn't be research trying to conduct like something like that motivated by such a goal. It's
sounds like good old phrenology.
Totally like
this. It was. So what I would say is you don't need to catch everything, because it's often like a ball of thread. So actually when you find something, then when you start pulling, how I started looking at publication was simply because I was still working more on the Western suppliers. And I remembered, I've come across a couple papers where they actually do research with the Chinese police to validate the technology. And I said, okay, what are those papers? I'm going to write down the couple of relevant papers. And then when I started looking for that, then there was suddenly more publications that was saying, oh, that is preoccupying. And then I kept pulling this thread, and before I knew it, I had like 1,000 papers. I was saying, this is an entire subfield. I mean, this is absolutely huge, where you have forensic population genetics. I looked at a sample of 500. In those 500 publications, we saw two things. Overrepresentation of studies on the most vulnerable minorities, the Uyghurs, the Tibetans. To give an idea, the Uyghurs are 1% of the population of China. They were studied in 1 out of 5 papers. And then in this group of 500 papers, half had a co-author with some kind of police-like affiliation. And then you say, okay, this is not the small thing. I mean, we're not picking like the last bit of grass. We're facing huge things. So I think that once you have something important like the phrenology, you actually have some experience in that field, because I was actually involved in one of the retractions. I didn't get the retraction. I actually was working on it when there was a big international disclosure about that paper, and then lots of Twitter stuff happening, and then actually that paper that was being reevaluated very slowly suddenly disappeared almost overnight, because there was so many people behind it protesting. And then more recently, to show how it can really work, recently I got a paper from one of my colleagues who's an editor at a major signal processing journal, not facial recognition journal. that actually concern had been raised about the paper, and that kind of went back up the food chain. And then my colleague said, well, I'm going to ask you, what do you think? And that paper was about predicting from faces whether criminals were violent or non-violent. Data from China again. And I think that's a good, so then you can start pulling the thread and you can start asking, okay, maybe that subfield, maybe that particular area, maybe not everyone needs to know about those specific studies, but everybody works in this area should be aware that there can be a problem. And then how do you find it? I think most of the time it's really by being conscious of what's before your eyes. It's like, it is there. You just have to want to see the pattern, because indeed when you see research, I mean, I worked on Uyghurs, I didn't know where Xinjiang was, I didn't know who the Uyghurs were, so everybody could say, well, how should I know there was a concern with Uyghurs? But there's lots of research on the Tibetans, and apparently nobody in that field asked themselves, is it okay that we do research on Tibetans who we know are a population that has been persecuted for decades? And nobody seemed to be asking questions. So you have to see the pattern, being willing to act, somewhere get the thread and start pulling the thread, and then you actually will see how big the problem is.
Yeah. So it's a lot of also raising awareness for some obvious red flags for people to actually think for themselves and start asking questions, right?
Yeah. Also, a big risk is the normalization of certain types of research. You are quickly in a posture where you don't question a certain piece of research because a lot of similar research has already been published. So you make the inference that because a lot of similar research has been published, therefore there cannot be really a problem. And so you have to work against that and realize that, well, maybe it can be that an entire field is problematic and that nobody really complained about it before.
Well, yeah. Yeah, pretty heavy stuff. Sorry.
I think we should also train young researchers to really think about the implications of their research, right? So that's an essential thing. I mean, some people do it automatically, right? But for others, they simply don't have the eye for it. So what we do in Berlin here, I think it's together with the Einstein Center for the Neurosciences and the Bernstein Center, we have like an autumn school or winter school for ethics attended by 200 people, so it's ethics and AI, and we try to sensitize them for particular issues. And I guess it's like when the nuclear bomb was developed, right? You should ask yourself about the consequences of your research, and then sometimes if you do that actively, you may see that there are pitfalls, and one should, think about them and discuss them with colleagues and not just proceed automatically.
Yeah, and perhaps also revise some of the rules on dual-use research, because I think it's really, this is also a major topic in regulation right now, to actually rethink non-proliferation 2.0, because obviously you cannot non-proliferate AI models like you can non-proliferate atomic bombs or nuclear material. But you have to think hard about the right ways and the right bottlenecks where you can try to start digging and start looking at certain safeguards. Think compute, think chips, think data, to make sure that this is used for good and proper purposes only. Before we open up the discussion for the audience, let me perhaps just take a step back with you for a final round of questions in terms of, we talked a lot about research, but to what extent does this affect us as persons and citizens? So recently there was this breach at 23andMe. What is the role of this kind of data beyond mere research purposes and beyond the specific oppression of certain minority groups in China and other countries for us in Europe? Maybe who wants to start?
Yeah, so maybe I'll start. For me, a big bottleneck, a big problem is that a large number of people, a large part of the population does not understand why privacy matters. And so a lot of people are willing to give away a lot of privacy guarantees, in particular when you claim it's all about security. So I think they're actually saying that at all levels, it's about the research, but researchers are still citizens. The research they do affects citizens, it's companies. For me, privacy is one important concept because we need to understand that it's not only about the rights of individual people who can be targeted because there are research participants in a sensitive piece of research, but that actually privacy matters even when you think it does not matter for you, because it's essential to the health of a free and open society. We want privacy as an individual right, but we also want privacy as a common good. We want privacy for LGBT activists, we want privacy for green activists, and sometimes, when they throw soup at the Mona Lisa, we might not approve of that, but they still need that privacy. There's a lot of, imagine an LGBT activist in Hungary these days. I mean, this is not 1,000 kilometers away. That's actually quite close. And I didn't check on the map, so maybe close to 1,000, but it's not that far. So we need actually to protect groups that are active in how society is evolving, because without privacy, we can possibly construct a safe society, but this will be a very sclerotic society where nothing can change, and we're going to keep going with the same power structures forever. And so if we want to avoid that, if that's not our goal, then we should actually realize how essential privacy is, and that's very hard to communicate to citizens, that this matters, that you should be against the idea that some camera on the road will give you a ticket because you're playing with your smartphone, which I actually feel, yeah, we should be doing that. But we should resist it because that's essential as avoiding this architecture of social control.
Other statements? Yeah.
Could perhaps add, so even if we are aware of this, right, I personally, this is a personal statement, have the problem that although I know I want to protect my data, for some things that I need to use, I face this challenge of if I don't protect my data, if I don't use a smartphone or something, I'll face kind of severe consequences, right? It's a bit of a convenience matter, so I could still live with a non-smartphone and have a telephone around, but in the end the cost gets very high, right? So even if we are aware of these things, where are we going to draw the bound, and how are we going to proceed as society? Because it's simply too easy, and also there's a certain pressure towards using these things, right? And we don't have control about that. And that gives me a very uneasy feeling very often in my personal life. So that adds to the educational part. And I don't know how to deal with that. I think we need more regulation, more awareness, and I don't know whether we can regulate companies. Obviously, that's very, very difficult, right? But as you ask about personal life, that's my contribution.
I'd also agree that as a society, we need to take care of privacy as a societal good and try to make sure that surveillance by the state, but also by large companies, is made as difficult as possible. Even if we regulate, let's say, face recognition in the public space through governmental bodies, I still don't want large private companies to sell models built on such data to maybe from other countries that transfer quite well to certain settings to other companies that might have some data collection restrictions. So I think it's a complicated picture, and especially considering changes in the political landscapes in this country, in other countries as well, that I find quite scary. I would like to make sure that the state knows and large companies know as little as possible about citizens regarding what they do, how they think about politics, what their sexual orientation is, how they identify in terms of gender, etc., etc. Saying that, at the same time, I think we put too much burden on individuals who cannot, in many cases, cannot even comprehend or don't even see the situations where they actually lose their privacy. And it's difficult even for researchers to understand, let's say, privacy mechanisms. So it's really difficult to advocate for that on an individual basis. So explain to a random person, I don't know what differential privacy is. It's going to be difficult. There's research on that, but it shows that it's really difficult. So we need to tackle that as a society. Maybe a last point, I think where we as researchers can do more is in terms of research transfer towards companies and organizations that collect data on a large scale, use data for modeling. We see that, for instance, in the mobility landscape, at least here in Germany, state-of-the-art privacy techniques companies are not aware of them, they don't understand them, they don't utilize them. We as researchers could contribute to passing those on to industry and maybe even building tools to make it easier to apply them. So that might be,
Yep.
way forward.
Excellent points. Vince,
Maybe following up on what we just heard, I believe that we somehow need a more nuanced approach to this. I mean, I mentioned before, so we have two normative domains. One is your domain, the law, the other one is ethics. And as you well know, in the end, what we do most is balancing. We know that if we say this is important in this case, then we have made certain decisions, and something else is then less important, but there might be collateral effects, there might be collateral damage. So I give an example. With colleagues from the TU München, we published a paper 1.5 years ago, 2 years ago, where we argued that actually supporting AI in healthcare research in Germany is unethical, because the access to the data is so hard, and then to allocate money into a data-driven technology is actually a waste of resources. We should use that money and put it into something that actually has a higher rate of success. So this is where I believe that we have, to a certain degree, too much privacy. And then we've heard, of course, we've heard about the events and today where we say, oh my God, we need more privacy. So we need somehow a more nuanced approach. And we also, I believe, somehow we need a better overall situation where we're not kind of forced to use certain things that we might not want to use, but at the same time, I cannot click anywhere to give my medical data to someone for research, but I click all the time where I've given my data away to someone, because otherwise I can't do X, which I need. And I think this is not right.
Yeah. And I fully agree. And one of the main problems, I guess, has been highlighted a lot of times in research as well, is that privacy and data protection, they have third-party effects, and that's what many people don't get. Even if you keep your data for yourself, if there is a lot of people who are similar to you, who are giving away your data, their data, it's very easy to triangulate and infer the very characteristics that you're trying to keep private about you. And same with, you know, the changing political landscapes that you mentioned. I really think that what's worrying me most is to future-proof these laws and or habits, because the GDPR is getting a lot of heat oftentimes, you know, but it's actually not such a bad instrument, because it has a lot of the things in it, like privacy by design, so that people don't actually have to opt out of all this stuff, which they never do, but they would have to opt into it, theoretically, right? Or purpose limitations, such that you can use things, and there's a preferential purpose facilitation for research, but then you cannot use it for anything else. And so the mechanism is not bad. It's often about implementing it and, you know, finding good practices, and actually in the end for that also sometimes checklists to actually implement that in practice and to make it work and operationalizable. And if we do that at the same time, think ahead, and I fully agree with the point that you made about, you know, the surveillance infrastructure, because once it is there in place, research shows there is function creep. You know, people are going to start asking, can't we use that data for XYZ? I mean, it was thought to be used, passenger name records, right? It is already happening. We had a big judgment by the CJU, Court of Justice of the European Union, on precisely this. And so I think in this shifting geopolitical and political landscape, it's really important to see that for future-proofing our lives, we need to reconsider the role of privacy, even in societies where we think at the moment checks and balances are working pretty well. With that, let's open up the discussion for the audience. We've touched on a number of issues, and you're welcome to ask questions about any of them, or also just, if you have, you know, problems with your own research, maybe you want to ask about best practices. And yes, and for the online audience, there is a Slido, so you can actually enter your questions. I think you can access it from the site, right, from the website where the talk is hosted. And we will draw on these questions in real time and ask them to the distinguished panelists. Who wants to start asking a question? Don't be shy. There is no bad questions, only bad answers. Anybody? Yeah, great. Can you just briefly identify yourself to the extent that you feel comfortable doing so?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Jess Roman, and I work at the Institute of Public Health at the Charité here in Berlin. Thank you very much for the nice introductory talk and this panel discussion. I think these points are, very important also in my field of biomedicine. We run an initiative for improving peer review, specifically engaging doctoral students in this process. And I know that you were talking a bit about how could we maybe safeguard some of these aspects in terms of regulation, quality control. Clearly, in the cases of these papers, we saw some pretty big failures of our system that we use in diverse scientific disciplines for quality control, which is peer review, editorial review by journals, and a big thanks to you, Yves, for kind of cleaning up some of these messes in retrospect. One question I have to the panel is, of course, peer review has its problems. Some fields don't use it at all. They rely exclusively on preprints or other forms of publication, yet maybe it could catch some of these problems in some cases, but of course that also depends on the peer reviewers and their quality. Do you think that there's any hope for peer review in this process to help out? Do you think that maybe it brings in with it a false sense of security? And what about trust of the general public in what we're doing as scientists? Thank you.
3 hard questions.
Hell yes.
What's to start?
Okay, so maybe I'll start. That's a tricky one because I have a hard time being super optimistic. I'll try to explain why I'm not super optimistic. So when I started looking into a set of problematic publications. So I have not gone after every single publication because you have to argue why a publication could be problematic. So you have to look at it in quite a bit of detail. So I've opened up about 100 cases, 30 something are resolved, mostly with retractions. Also some journals that told me, no, we're not going to consider this complaint further. But the effect has been that some journals realized that there were some things that were too sensitive to touch. So what I really noticed was forensic genetics on Uyghurs. That was something that because of the political climate became quickly toxic, and that people didn't want to touch that anymore. Then when you say, yeah, but what about that next group, the Kazakh, the Uyghurs, which are exactly as problematic, they would say, well, who are these people? We don't know about them. So that there's, there are limitations to that. But at least there was an effect. But the problem that I saw was that suddenly I've had a big batch of 18 retractions at once, and that situation was very special. Because actually when I wrote to the journal, I wrote in a very constructive manner. I said, actually, you are a clinical genetic journal, so you're not a forensic genetic journal. Over the years, you have barely published any forensic genetic study, none about Chinese populations. And in the previous 18 months, you published 18 articles on forensic genetics of Chinese populations. You are the most prolific journal in this research area at the moment. So I thought I was actually giving them making them a service by actually telling them, well, you have a big problem. And it's been almost 3 years that I needed to actually get this bundle of papers retracted because there was a lot of resistance. But the main effect was that actually the research, as it got pushed back somewhere in the field, actually started re-emerging elsewhere in other journals. And we're still not talking about predatory journals. So this manuscript will kind of, being hit like a whack-a-mole, and then they will plunge back and then try to re-emerge somewhere else. So to actually catch that fully, you basically would have to be everywhere to have, what about the mega journals? How does that work? What about editors with major conflicts of interest? Because suddenly you realize, oh yeah, that paper got published, but the only editor with the expertise on this field has actually published 3 papers with the Chinese police in the past 3 years. Because you also have that the editors can have conflicts. So it would require a lot of change. I think that one way that you have an impact is that you're sending a clear social signal. I mean, researchers realize that if suddenly in a journal where they used to publish that research, they get their paper just returned, and then it happens 2 or 3 times, they will take time, so they will have some form of pressure. Of course, if these people are working closely with the police, well, they'll still do their research one way or another, but at least you're sending a signal. Whether we can rescue peer review completely and say, no, we're going to catch every instance, I think it's going to be much more messy than that, unfortunately.
I mean, it's probably also about just increasing the chance. And one problem that I see, and maybe a partial solution could be, so the law usually defines some minimum standards, but many of the problems that we also heard about are in the ethical domain, where there is no law governing it. And what we see in medicine is, in medicine we have a very strong, what's called in German ethos, like a set of professional ethics rules. And this is very strong and is very old, if you think back Hippocratic Oath and all of the long tradition of a set of rules that medical doctors should abide by. A doctor doesn't do that. And I see potential in strengthening this in the research field as well as, let's say, in the AI developer field. I don't see it yet, and it's a long discussion, and there are many hurdles to it. There are big differences between the medical field and these fields. I know that, but still I see potential in strengthening this idea. A researcher doesn't do that. An AI developer doesn't do that. As kind of a professional set of ethics that could, ethics rules that could help to increase the chances that something like this doesn't happen. There are also scandals in medicine. It's not foolproof. But what we want is to make it less likely, and that this could be an idea.
I would say some journals even require that, right? So, I mean, you mentioned NeurIPS as a conference and proceedings, but on the other hand, I also know of a colleague working in computer science, for example, where they developed algorithms for sexual predators in chats and online chats to identify these predators who were going after youngsters and trying to, harass them. And that's ethically highly challenging. So I know that at the time they were asked by the journal, and I don't know whether that was initiated by reviewers or not, to come up with a statement, right? And to discuss that in the paper and to provide an extra letter with that. So I'm not sure this is going to prevent everything, but I think the journals that are good will kind of ask for these things, in particular for AI-based research where ethical implications matter more and more. So I think it will not be worse than the general problems that we have with peer review. I see some hope, just to give some optimism a little bit.
Yeah, and also, I mean, we talked about data sheets, we talked about model cards. You could probably imagine some like reviewer sheets, which oftentimes actually there are, but maybe they don't include the right red flags yet. Or as a reviewer, oftentimes you have very little time. You 2 weeks late anyways, and then you don't want to read through all these 10 pages of what I know how to do a review, right? So somehow making this more salient, particularly in areas that are, say, sensitive or problematic in this respect, that might really be something where reviewers really have to, go through a procedure and scroll through this and click, yes, I've read it. Even if they haven't read it, they at least need to, scroll through this, and that might make them aware of the fact that this is some of the red flags that they need to take into account. And I think, some of the good journals, good conferences, if they are doing this, you said it's popping up somewhere else, but as you also said before, it's about really foreclosing some of these high standard, high quality journals, because otherwise, if other people see, oh, this has been published in XYZ, and it can't be that bad, right? If it's published in some minor journal somewhere else, and then that impression of academic sanctity doesn't arise as easily.
Yeah. So about these checks for reviewers, I think there's also another important element that actually means that this requirement exists. So to be very specific, when I looked at ethnic facial recognition, there was actually a couple papers. I obtained a retraction there of one paper on ethnic facial recognitions of Uyghurs. And that was a retraction from the IEEE, so which is a big publisher of engineering, electrical engineering, including machine learning, pattern recognition journals. And they didn't want to retract everything, so they retracted one, and then the other two, they put expressions of concerns. But they actually said, well, actually, this was not part of our workflow. Therefore, they added something about human subject research, because for engineers, when you look at images, you're not doing human subject research. Well, you actually are by, for example, US common rule standards. It is actually human subject research. You should be careful with this kind of research. And so they added that to their workflow, which means now there is a checkbox. It's an easy one. It's like, yes, no, you don't have to fill 20 pages. So that's good. But mostly now it creates a bottleneck, because you can say, that is part of the requirement. A big part is also about saying, the publishers will say, well, actually, you may be right, but that was not very clear, you know, to this researcher that standard applied in this way. You know, in what way do ethical standards apply? That's also very much a matter of discussion. By having that, then I said, well, thank you very much. If ever I see anything problematic, I'll come back to you and I'll say, well, the reviewers and the authors checked the box that they actually knew about this requirement. And maybe it was not true, but at least the box was checked, and that gives you a leverage to actually say, well, there is a problem here.
Very good points. Further questions, or do we have any questions online? Not yet.
Yeah, so my name is Ulf. I'm also from the Quest Center for Responsible Research. So this is, of course, the whole discussion, of course, a bit kind of connected, because it's the Einstein Center or the Einstein Foundation that funds research, very much research focused. But Yves, what do you think? How much of this is done without publications, without anything that we can track? I mean, this is only you're just catching Thermo Fisher or whoever who wants to validate their devices, and this is certainly something that they shouldn't do. But there's certainly, I guess, research going on that is pushing the limits there, either in the Chinese government or even if we talk about LLMs. There is research that is just not published, that is just not transparent. And if you say that perhaps they didn't know about certain specifics of their LLMs, well, at least they didn't tell us. And we cannot, there is no oversight here. So Yves, so what do you think? So how much deeper is the problem really than what we can see on the surface with the excellent work that you did?
Yeah, so for example, for every paper, you know, validating a certain kit in one or a couple populations, you can assume that on a scale of the whole country, the same research has been done for every single ethnic group in China. So it's probably a factor 20, 30 bigger than what we see reported. Now, at least in that field, I think that there was it's high tech, so people like to publish papers. Even people in companies, you know, forensic genetic labs, these are full of PhDs. The people who did some years in academia and then they didn't get to become a professor, so they went to work for a lab. They have the culture, the academic culture, they have the social status. They want to progress in their career in very technical jobs. They want to show that they are the best experts. So I think there is a natural tendency from some of that information to re-emerge. Of course, when you start pushing back, then it will disappear back and you will not see it as you did before. Concrete examples, researchers that actually show two affiliations on a paper, one with a university, one with a police office, are now showing a single university application. So you have to track them by name and say, okay, I knew you. I mean, this the person I showed the photo, one of the recent paper, he only had a university affiliation on the paper. So of course, things will go and hide back when you put them in the spotlight. Will the work stop? It won't, but will the pressure be real? I think the pressure is very real. So can we stop, you know, a government like the Chinese government from deploying DNA databases just like that, just by saying you're being a bad boy? That's not, you know, that's not possible. But do we have a tangible impact? You know, I'm quite sure. For example, for the Uyghurs, there was a clear plan to collect DNA profiles of everybody between age 12 and 65. We've seen those guidelines, and we actually are not seeing as many profiles in the national DNA database of the police as we would expect. So we don't know whether there is a local DNA database, a provincial DNA database that's not accessible by the national at the national level. You have to be in Xinjiang, or we don't know whether the blood samples were collected, but they're kept in some warehouse to be processed later, but they haven't been processed. But I would say that there was a very clear plan to have a DNA database of the entire population of Xinjiang, and that DNA database does not exist at the national level. So the impact is real. You know, magically solving the problems of that magnitude, that doesn't happen. But I think that pushing back, creating clear cultural, social norms. I mean, for Chinese researchers, for example, the dynamic has changed. They were used to come and do postdocs in Europe, in the United States, no questions asked. They were used to get recognition, and now suddenly they feel like, okay, there is some form of pressure. Is that enough to tell the Chinese authorities, I'm not going to do this work anymore? Probably not, because if they say that, well, they're going to be in trouble themselves very seriously. So we have to be a little bit pragmatic in what we can hope, but I'm quite confident that real pressure does have an impact.
Is there a question online? Or?
Yeah, there's a question online from Adam Cleaver, and he asks, is the procedure of agreements full of legalese for users to scroll through and accept addressed? Is it reasonable to assume users to have read and understood?
What kind of users, do you know?
I'm waiting for a specification now.
Maybe he refers to end-user license agreements and the internet. And
privacy.
No, there is no expectation for that to be read. Obviously not. I'm not joking. It's like it's not expected to be read because it would be highly inefficient. There is a lot of research on why there is no obligation, no expectation of this to be read. It's out there so that on the one hand, you can have a handle against the companies if they do something that they didn't put out or disclose. And on the other hand, it's for watchdogs. You can also automatically analyze it with ML tools. It's for agencies, but it's not for the individual consumer. Nobody expects the individual consumer to read this. This is not the way this model has been conceived, and that's a common misunderstanding. And there's research showing that significantly less than 1% actually read that, which is absolutely rational.
That's a lot.
Yeah, it's significantly less than 1%. It's 1 out of 1,000, and I don't know who these people are.
Still a lot.
I guess it's like 1 out of 1,000. That's probably the quota of law professors in this one. Well, any other questions? If not, we're almost out of time. So we take one more question. That's fine, I think.
Thank you. Okay, my name is Gina Bartscherer. I'm from the Robert K. Merton Center for Science Studies. My question, since we've talked a lot about science research and AI in that setting, I was wondering, how do you think about the commercial side of AI? Is there any way of actually making sure that there is an ethical conduct there? Because the incentive structure is always to make money. How does one marry those things with ethics? That would be my question.
I think you need to force. I mean, there's the moment we see it in any other. I mean, you would think, I used that example already. You would think company making airplanes would be careful, especially since the people use them themselves probably, and no. So I really believe that if we're in these high-risk areas, and this is reflected by the already existing legislation, the MDR, now the AI Act also covers medical tools. So now we have basically 2 legislations covering medical tools in general, but also medical AI tools. Is it still a guarantee? No, but at least it's a very high minimum standard. And then additionally, as I mentioned before, then we need, in what is not governed by that, we need something that is still better. So maybe the professional ethics, maybe generally more education on these matters. Every little, piece of this increases the chances that things are more ethical. The current situation is really bad. So we looked into this last year. We looked at, I think it was 14 tools, radiology tools of class 2B from the risk class 2B, and we looked at the transparency levels. These are certified tools that potentially someone could buy and use on patients, and for many of these tools, there was simply nothing that we could find that was publicly transparently available. So we don't know on which data the tool was trained. We don't know anything, but potentially a hospital could buy it and use it on patients. So almost everything is better than this status quo. So we definitely need to improve.
And even for the open source models, by the way, sometimes there's many ways to open source something. Oftentimes the model itself is made open source, but the training data is not. And even the architecture, the ML architecture might not be, for obvious reasons, because if you disclose the training data, you disclose that there's all kinds of stuff in there that shouldn't have been in there. And you open up yourself to massive lawsuits that are still happening. But yeah, I'm moderately optimistic that the AI is going to do something there. We've seen a lot of pushback from technology companies, large technology companies, in terms of lobbying efforts. So they probably didn't do it for nothing. So there is something to be said there that there is a regime now in place with, even agencies that can look under the hood that are being staffed right now and hopefully staffed well. Well, that's the most we can do, I guess.
I would also say that companies can be sensitive to social pressure, but there is some kind of threshold effect. So they will try to ignore social pressure, but you have to bring the balance at a level where there is like a balance of forces that is actually for change. So when Human Rights Watch started writing letters to Thermo Fisher, you get some kind of canned response back. When suddenly you have a major Republican senator on Fox News denouncing Thermo Fisher, then the dynamics has changed, okay? When customers, this is not my case, but in other fields, when customers start, Boeing, I checked the plane. I told my wife, I did check, we're flying on an Airbus. So that kind of social pressure will have an impact. So the question is, how do you build social pressure when you want to reach a goal? That is not straightforward, but I would say big companies can't. It's really like in French, it's a giant on weak feet, something like that we say. It's surprising that at some point this mega corporation actually certainly chickens out. That can be very surprising, where they stopping the sales of product to the police in Tibet. That was the result of a campaign by Tibetan activists. It was a one-year campaign, and apparently in the end they said, this is so much that we sell for so much in Tibet. This is not worth the money. Of course, when there is billions at stake, it's not the same thing when there is only millions at stake. And so the dynamics can be different. But we have this idea of the corporation as all-powerful, and the social reality is much more complex than that.
I think that might be a good statement to finish our discussion, encouraging to a certain extent that there are things we can do both in research, in society, and in the economy. Thank you so much to all of you. A big round of applause for the panelists, and specifically so for Yves for all of his fantastic work and for the prize that he's rightfully getting today. All right, and now we have a round of coffee, I think, outside.
Super.